She had stitched a man's femoral artery shut with a bootlace in a ditch outside Kandahar while taking fire from 3 directions. She had kept a 19-year-old alive for 6 hours in a burned-out vehicle with nothing but a field kit and sheer refusal to let him die. She had done things in the dark, in the dirt, in places that didn't appear on any map, that would make half the surgeons in this building go pale. And right now, Dr. Adrian Cross was pointing his finger 2 inches from her face and telling her she didn't belong in his emergency room. "You're just a nurse," he said. "Get your hands off my patient and get out of my operating bay before I have security drag you out." Rachel Morgan didn't flinch, not even a little. If this story has you hooked already, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Riverstone Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Briar Falls, a mid-sized city that liked to call itself progressive, and mostly wasn't. The hospital had been through 2 ownership changes, one malpractice scandal that got settled quietly, and a complete executive overhaul 4 years back that had left the administrative culture exactly as dysfunctional as before, just with newer letterhead. It was the kind of place where who you knew mattered more than what you could do, and where titles got used like weapons. Rachel had known all of that when she took the job 14 months ago. She'd taken it anyway. She was 31, compact, with the kind of stillness about her that most people misread as passivity. She kept her dark hair pulled back tight, wore no jewelry on shift, and had a habit of standing just slightly apart from whatever group was gathered in a room, observing, cataloging, calculating. Her performance reviews were spotless. Her patients recovered at rates that the charge nurses whispered about in the break room. She never raised her voice. She almost never smiled. What she did do was notice things. Everything. Always. She'd noticed, for instance, that the patient in Bay 7, a 54-year-old man named Gerald Watts, admitted for a routine cardiac workup, had been showing signs of tension pneumothorax for the last 11 minutes. She'd noticed the shift in his breath sounds when she'd checked his IV line. She'd noticed the subtle tracheal deviation, the way his neck veins had gone rope-tight, the slight but unmistakable bluish cast starting at the margins of his lips. She had flagged it to the attending on rotation, who'd brushed her off. She had documented it at the nursing station. And then she'd gone back to Bay 7 herself and started setting up for a needle decompression because Gerald Watts was going to be dead in under 4 minutes if someone didn't act. And she was the only person in this wing who seemed to understand that. That was when Dr. Adrian Cross had walked in. He was 52, silver-haired, with the kind of broad-shouldered authority that photographs well in hospital brochures. Chief of trauma surgery for 6 years running, the kind of man who had his name on a plaque in the lobby and expected people to remember it. He ran his surgical floor the way certain generals run armies, through fear, through favoritism, and through the carefully maintained fiction that all good ideas originated with him. He looked at Rachel standing over Gerald Watts with a 14-gauge needle in her gloved hand, and his face went a particular shade of red that she had learned over 14 months meant incoming. "What," he said very quietly, "do you think you're doing?" "Tension pneumo," Rachel said. She didn't look up from the patient. "Left side. He needs immediate decompression." "I have eyes, Morgan. I also have a medical degree. Step back." "His sats are dropping. We don't have time to Step back." She stepped back. Barely. Enough to give him room, not enough to indicate she agreed with him. She kept her eyes on the monitor. Cross moved to the patient, spent about 7 seconds examining him, and then turned around to face her with the full weight of his authority arranged across his features like armor. "Anxiety episode," he said. "I've seen this presentation 100 times. We'll get him some Ativan and monitor." "Dr. Cross?" Her voice was flat, factual. "His trachea is deviated. That's not anxiety." "Are you diagnosing my patient?" "I'm telling you what I'm seeing." "You're a nurse." He said the word the way some people say, just to before anything, to shrink it, to diminish it, to remind you of your place in a hierarchy that has no patience for inconvenient observations from inconvenient people. "You take vitals. You administer medications that I order. You do not put needles in patients without physician authorization, and you do not stand in my emergency room and contradict my assessments. Are we clear?" Your patient doesn't have time for your ego, Rachel said. The room went still. Two nurses at the station outside the bay had frozen. A resident who'd been walking past stopped in the doorway. Even the monitors seemed to hold their breath. Cross stared at her. The red had spread down his neck. Get out, he said. Get out of this bay, get out of this wing, and when your shift ends, don't bother coming back. I'll have your badge by end of day. Rachel looked at Gerald Watts. His lips were going blue faster now. She looked at the monitor. She looked at Cross. Fine, she said. But someone needs to decompress him in the next 2 minutes. She set the needle down on the tray, pulled off one glove, then the other, walked out of the bay at a pace that was measured and deliberate, not rushed, not defeated, the walk of someone who has made a decision and is at peace with it. Behind her, she heard the monitor alarm spike. She heard Cross snap at the resident to get in there. She heard the scramble of feet, the clatter of equipment, the barked order for a chest tray. She didn't stop walking. She went to the nursing station, sat down, pulled up the incident documentation she'd started 11 minutes ago, and finished it. Every observation, every timestamp, every exchange. Her handwriting, metaphorically speaking since it was typed, was precise and without editorializing. She noted Cross's assessment. She noted the contradiction with clinical findings. She noted the time of the monitor alarm. She'd been doing this for 14 months. The filing cabinet in the spare room of her apartment had 43 documented incidents in it, cross-dismissing nursing staff observations that later proved correct. Cross-altering procedure notes. Cross-running interference on a case review that had threatened to surface some uncomfortable questions about a patient outcome from 2 years prior. Cross and the network of attending physicians and administrative allies who kept him comfortable, who smoothed things over, who ensured that complaints filed against him somehow lost momentum between the filing and the review. Rachel had learned a long time ago that documentation was a weapon. You just had to be patient with it. The rest of her shift passed the way most of them did. In controlled motion, in the small calculations of care that people who hadn't done the work never understood. She triaged a construction worker with a fractured forearm, talked a frightened 17-year-old through a panic attack, managed post-op checks on 2 patients in the recovery wing, and consulted with a cardiologist about a patient whose medication interaction she'd flagged the previous week. Nobody told her she'd been right about Gerald Watts. Nobody had to. She'd seen the chest tube cart being wheeled past Bay 7 40 minutes after she'd left. At the nursing station, she ran into Deb Salazar, one of the older floor nurses, 22 years at Riverstone, the institutional memory of the place, a woman who knew where every body was buried and occasionally dropped hints about it in the break room. Cross is filing a formal complaint, Deb said, not looking up from her chart. HR by end of week. I know. You're not worried? Rachel considered the question. No. Deb finally looked up. She had the kind of face that had stopped trying to hide what it was thinking sometime in her mid-40s. You've got something, don't you? On him. I've got documentation, Rachel said. That's all. That's not nothing. No, Rachel agreed. It's not. Deb studied her for a moment with something that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite unease. Something in between, something that happened when you realized the quiet person you'd been working next to for over a year was not what you'd assumed. You've been building this for a while. Rachel didn't answer. She went back to her charting. She was in the medication room at 4:47 p.m. when Deb's voice came sharp over the unit intercom. Not the standard page, not the routine overhead announcement, but the clipped, urgent tone that cut through everything and made every nurse within earshot straighten up. Mass casualty incoming. All available trauma staff to the ER bay immediately. Repeat. Mass casualty incoming. Rachel was moving before the words finished. The ER lobby was controlled chaos when she came through the doors. The kind of chaos that looks overwhelming from the outside and, if you've been trained correctly, resolves into a sequence of problems with identifiable solutions. She could see the ambulance bay from the interior corridor, could see the trucks pulling in, could see the red and blue of emergency vehicles strobing against the glass. What she couldn't immediately process was the other thing outside. Military helicopters. Not the medical evac kind. Not the civilian air ambulance with the Red Cross on the hull. These were dark, heavy, the kind that didn't appear over mid-sized American cities without a reason. 2 of them, coming down in the open lot adjacent to the ER entrance, their rotors churning the late afternoon air into something that rattled the windows. People in the lobby were staring. Rachel wasn't staring, she was counting. 2 birds. Military configuration. They were moving fast and landing hard, which meant whoever was in them had not had a smooth day. The first patients came through the ambulance bay doors at 4:51. Civilians first, a family of 4 from what looked like a vehicle collision, standard protocol. And then behind them, carried on stretchers by men in tactical gear, came the soldiers. There were 9 of them. The ER nursing staff froze for exactly 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than they could afford. Rachel didn't freeze. She moved to the first stretcher, assessed the patient in under 4 seconds, GSW to the right shoulder, through and through, controlled bleeding but shock risk, needed a line immediately, and looked up to find the triage nurse staring at the tactical gear like she'd never seen it before. "Kayla," Rachel's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I need 2 large bore IVs, O negative standing by, and get respiratory down here now. Go." Kayla went. The second stretcher, blast injury, probable tympanic rupture, burns to the forearms and neck, conscious but disoriented. Third, abdominal trauma, rigid belly, internal bleed likely. This one needed the OR in the next 20 minutes, or he wasn't going to need anything. She was moving between them with the fluid efficiency of someone who had done this in conditions that made this ER look like a spa. She'd done it in the dark. She'd done it in the rain. She'd done it with nothing but what she could carry on her back and whatever the terrain offered. The white linoleum and fluorescent lights were practically luxurious. "Who's running triage?" The voice came from behind her, deep, authoritative, not panicked. She turned. The man standing at the edge of the ER bay was in military dress, not tactical gear. He'd come in from a different vehicle, or changed, or simply operated at a level where the uniform was what mattered. He was in his early 50s, black, with the kind of weathered stillness that came from decades of controlled stress. His insignia put him at colonel. He was looking at her, not at the chaos, not at the stretchers or the staff or the monitors going off in overlapping patterns, at her. "Morgan," he said. The sound of her name from this man's mouth, her last name, her military name, said the way it had been said in briefings and debriefs and field reports, landed in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. She hadn't heard it said like that in 3 years. "Colonel Haskell," she said. He crossed the distance between them in 4 strides and stopped about 18 inches away, which was the kind of distance that meant, "I know you and I trust you, and I need you right now all at once." "How bad is it?" he asked. "Abdominal patient needs OR in 20 minutes, maybe less. 2 more will need surgical consult within the hour. Rest are manageable if we get them stabilized fast." She glanced back at the stretchers. "What happened?" "Convoy ambush, 40 miles out. 3 vehicles." His jaw tightened. "These are my people, Morgan." "I know," she said. "I've got them." And then the doors slammed open, and Dr. Adrian Cross came through them like a man who had just been informed that something was happening in his hospital without his permission, which was the thing he hated most in the world. He took in the scene. The military stretchers, the tactical personnel lining the walls, the helicopters still visible through the glass, and Rachel Morgan standing in the middle of his emergency room giving orders to his nursing staff. And his face arranged itself into something that was equal parts fury and territorial alarm. "What is happening here?" He wasn't asking anyone in particular. He was announcing. "Who authorized this?" "Morgan, what are you still doing in this department? I filed a complaint." "Dr. Cross." Her voice was even. "I have 9 trauma patients, one of whom needs the OR immediately. I need you to—" "You need me?" He stepped toward her. "You were told to leave. You don't work here right now. You're on administrative hold pending—" "Doctor!" Colonel Haskell's voice was not loud. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud because it had spent decades being listened to regardless. "We need triage run now. Who is your trauma lead?" Cross straightened, looked at the colonel's uniform, reassessed, recalibrated. "I'm the chief of trauma surgery, Dr. Adrian Cross, and I'm going to need everyone to step back while my team—" "Your team has been standing still for 4 minutes, Haskell said. He wasn't accusatory. He was just accurate. Sergeant Reyes is going to lose his spleen in the next 15 minutes if someone doesn't open him up. Are you the person doing that, or is she? Cross blinked. Haskell looked at Rachel. She is, he said. Not a question. Cross's face went through several colors in rapid succession. She is a nurse. She does not have surgical authority in this facility. She does not have the credentials to... I don't need surgical authority, Rachel said. She was already moving, already back at the abdominal patient. Reyes, apparently, 23 years old, his face the gray-white of significant blood loss. I need a surgeon. Dr. Cross, you are a surgeon. Your patient is right here. Are you going to operate or are you going to keep talking? The gauntlet was there on the floor between them. Cross stared at her, then at the patient, then at Haskell, whose expression had not shifted by a single degree. Get him to OR2, Cross finally said, to nobody in particular, and someone get me a full surgical team now. Rachel stepped back from the stretcher as the OR team came forward, not because Cross had told her to, because Reyes was going where he needed to go, and she had 8 other patients that nobody was managing. She went back to work. For the next 90 minutes, the Riverstone ER ran at a pitch it had not seen in years. Rachel moved between patients with the systematic efficiency of someone who had triage not as a skill, but as a reflex, a thing built into her at such a foundational level that it didn't require thought, only execution. She got lines in, she managed airways, she directed staff with the kind of quiet precision that didn't ask for compliance so much as assume it, and the staff complied. Even the ones who'd never spoken to her directly. Even the attending physicians who'd spent 14 months treating her like furniture. Something was different in the room, and everyone could feel it, even if nobody could articulate it yet. Colonel Haskell stayed. His tactical staff stayed. They moved to the periphery, cleared space, answered questions from the ER nurses about patient histories with the clipped efficiency of people accustomed to information exchange under pressure. They didn't get in the way. They watched. Twice, Rachel caught Haskell watching her specifically. The first time, she looked away and kept moving. The second time, she held his gaze for a half second, and something passed between them that had no name and didn't need one. She knew what he was doing. She knew what he had seen. She'd worked under his command for 2 years, in places that didn't appear on public maps, doing things that were not going to be on any resume. He had put her in for a commendation once that she'd declined to receive publicly. He knew exactly what she was capable of. The question was who else was going to find out. By 6:30 p.m., 6 of the 9 patients were stabilized. Reyes was out of surgery. Cross had operated. She'd give him that. He was a competent surgeon when he was actually doing surgery instead of performing authority. And in recovery. 2 more were in surgical consult. The last, the shoulder wound, was sitting up and arguing about whether he could leave. Rachel was updating charts at the station when she heard Cross's voice rise behind her. She didn't turn around immediately. She'd learned that turning around too quickly looked reactive, and reactive was not what she was right now. I want to know who authorized her to run triage in my department, Cross was saying. He was talking to someone administrative. She could tell by the flattened tone he used with hospital management, careful and controlled, but underneath it the same pressure as always. She was on administrative hold. She should have been escorted out. Now I've got military personnel in my ER and a nurse who thinks she runs Dr. Cross. She turned around at that. Haskell was standing 6 feet from Cross, and he'd brought someone with him. A woman Rachel didn't recognize, in civilian clothes but with the bearing of someone who didn't need a uniform to command a room. She was holding a tablet. She looked like she hadn't smiled in recent memory and wasn't planning to start. My name is Special Agent Dana Forsyth, the woman said. She showed credentials briefly, efficiently. I'm with the Army Criminal Investigation Division. We have some questions about this facility's emergency response protocols. She paused. And about some other matters that have come to our attention. Cross blinked. What? This is a civilian hospital. You don't have jurisdiction when the patients involved are active duty military personnel injured in a potential domestic incident, Forsyth said. We have quite a lot of jurisdiction. Thank you for your concern. She looked at her tablet. Dr. Adrian Cross, Chief of Trauma Surgery. Yes. Can you tell me, she said very pleasantly, about the formal complaint you filed today against one of your nursing staff? The ER went quiet. Not the relative quiet of a slow night. The actual electric quiet of a room full of people who have stopped pretending to do other things. Cross's jaw tightened. That's an internal HR matter. It's a matter of some interest to us, Forsyth said, given that the nurse in question appears to have been the primary reason 9 of your patients tonight are alive. She looked up from the tablet. Also given what we know about her background. A pause. Which is quite a bit. Rachel was still standing at the nursing station. She hadn't moved. She could feel eyes on her from every direction. Nurses, attendings, the tactical staff along the wall, the hospital administrator who'd materialized in the doorway at some point in the last 5 minutes, looking like he wasn't sure whether to stay or run. Cross turned to look at her, and for the first time in 14 months, his expression had something in it that wasn't contempt or impatience or the casual dismissal of someone who'd decided she didn't matter. It was something else. Rachel held his gaze. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Morgan. Haskell's voice was quiet, meant for her. He crossed to the station, stopped beside her, and lowered his voice further. We need to talk. Privately, when you have a moment. I know, she said. There's more coming, he said. Tonight. This isn't just about the convoy. She looked at him. The fluorescent lights of the ER were not kind to anyone, but they didn't change anything about Haskell's face. The same weathered certainty she'd known for years, the same steadiness under pressure that had made him the person you wanted running an op when everything else was going sideways. What else? She asked. He glanced at Cross, who was now being spoken to in low, serious tones by Forsyth, while the administrator hovered at a distance that was trying to look casual and failing completely. The convoy wasn't random, Haskell said, and some of the intel trail we're following leads back to this facility. He paused. To some decisions made in this facility. Some records. Rachel was quiet for a moment. How long have you known? She asked. Long enough, he said, but we needed this. He looked out across the ER bay. The stretchers. The military personnel. The staff frozen in various states of realization. We needed them here. We needed it visible. Rachel followed his gaze. Across the room, Forsyth had stopped talking. Cross was standing very still, the way people stand when something is dawning on them that they don't want to arrive. He's going to run, Rachel said quietly. He won't get far. I know. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs, the small, flat rectangle of a USB drive, the kind that could easily be mistaken for a patient ID card if you didn't know what you were looking at. She'd carried it for 6 weeks. She set it on the counter between them without ceremony. Haskell looked at it, looked at her. 14 months, she said. Every incident, every altered note, every complaint that disappeared, 2 patient outcomes that don't match their documented care, and 1 very specific transaction record from 18 months ago that took me a while to trace, but that I believe your investigators will find interesting. Haskell picked up the drive. He was quiet for a moment. You were building a case, he said, not surprised, just confirming. I was protecting patients, Rachel said. The case was what happened when nobody else would. Across the ER, Adrian Cross turned. His eyes found Rachel. And in the particular quality of that look, the sudden calculation in it, the sharp reassessment, the dawning and terrible understanding that he had been wrong about who she was for every single day of the 14 months she'd worked in his hospital, Rachel saw it. The moment he realized. She picked up her pen, went back to her chart. Outside the hospital, the military helicopters were still there, their rotors cold now, settled into the asphalt of the parking lot like they planned to stay a while. They did. Cross didn't move immediately. That was the thing Rachel noticed. Not flight, not confrontation, just that particular stillness of a man running calculations behind his eyes, trying to determine which version of this situation he could still survive. She'd seen that look before. Not in hospitals. In other rooms, in other countries, on other faces. It was the look of someone who had operated for a long time inside a system that protected them and was only now beginning to understand that the system had shifted without their knowledge. She went back to her chart. Let him calculate. Forsyth had moved on. She was speaking quietly with two of Haskell's people near the ambulance bay entrance, and whatever they were discussing had the low-frequency seriousness of something that had been in motion for longer than tonight. Rachel kept her peripheral attention on Cross while her hands kept moving across the keyboard. Old habit. You watched the room without appearing to watch the room, because the moment a threat knew it was being observed, it changed its behavior. And you wanted behavior that was authentic, not performed. Deb Salazar appeared at her elbow with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had survived 2 decades in this building by knowing when to be invisible and when to show up. Cross just called legal, Deb said, low and even. His phone, in the supply corridor off Bay 3. I wasn't listening on purpose. But you were in the corridor. I needed gauze. Rachel almost smiled. What did he say? Something about protected records. Something about prior authorization. Deb paused. He said, this has nothing to do with the convoy, which is an interesting thing to say when nobody has accused you of anything yet. Rachel saved her chart. Thank you, Deb. Don't thank me. I've been watching that man for 6 years. She picked up a clipboard that didn't need to be picked up and moved away down the hall with the practiced nonchalance of someone who had been doing this longer than Rachel had been alive. Haskell was back beside her in under 3 minutes, which told her Forsyth had briefed him on the legal call faster than most people briefed anyone on anything. He's going to claim the personnel records are under hospital administrative privilege, Haskell said. He can claim whatever he wants. The records I gave you aren't hospital records. She didn't look up from the screen. They're mine. My documentation, taken in the course of my work, time-stamped, and corroborated by patient charts that are already part of the public medical record. Forsyth wants to move on the administrative files tonight. She'll need a federal warrant. She has one. He said it the way you say something that was handled before the conversation started. Has had one since this afternoon. Rachel stopped typing, looked at him. How long has this been planned? Haskell's expression shifted. Not guilt exactly, but the particular discomfort of a man who was going to tell a partial truth and knew the person he was telling it to would recognize it as such. The CID investigation has been running for 11 weeks. The convoy was real. That wasn't staged. My people were genuinely hit. But the decision to come here, to this facility specifically, was not random. No. She processed that. 11 weeks. While she'd been documenting incidents and filing them in a cabinet in her apartment and wondering whether any of it would ever matter, there had been a federal investigation running in parallel. They'd been building toward the same point from different directions. You should have told me, she said. You would have behaved differently. I would have behaved exactly the same. I know, he said. That's why I didn't tell you. I needed it to be real. She looked at him for a long moment. The thing about Haskell was that he was not a man who manipulated people for personal gain. He manipulated situations toward outcomes he believed were correct, which was a distinction that mattered to him and that she understood even when it made her want to argue with him. The transaction record, she said, the one I flagged. You already knew about it. We had part of it. You had the piece we were missing. She nodded once. Not forgiveness, not quite. Acceptance of the facts as they were. What happens now? Forsyth executes the warrant. We secure the records. Cross is going to make this complicated. He glanced across the ER. He's already making it complicated. So, he was. She could see it from 50 feet away. Cross had emerged from the supply corridor and was now in intense, low-voiced conversation with the hospital's chief administrative officer, a man named Patterson, whose primary skill, as far as Rachel had ever been able to determine, was surviving organizational chaos by positioning himself adjacent to whoever held the most power at any given moment. He was nodding at whatever Cross was saying with the focused attention of someone being told their job depended on the next 10 minutes. Patterson had never spoken directly to Rachel in 14 months. He had walked past her in corridors, sat in the same administrative meetings, attended the same department briefings. He had looked through her the way certain people look through nurses, not with contempt exactly, more with a kind of institutional blindness, as though the people doing the daily work of keeping patients alive existed in a parallel dimension that only intersected with his own when something went wrong. Something was very wrong now, and she watched his eyes finally find her across the ER bay with the slightly startled quality of a man who has just been told that the furniture talks. She let him look, went back to her charts. The warrant served itself, more or less. Forsyth and two CID agents moved through the administrative corridor at 7:14 p.m. with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before and had no interest in theater. No raised voices, no dramatic announcements. They simply appeared at the records office with a federal document and a portable drive and the patience of people who were going to wait however long it took. Rachel heard about it from Kayla, who heard about it from the unit secretary, who had apparently watched the whole thing from the break room window with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for something like this for longer than she'd admitted to herself. They took his files, Kayla said. She was trying to sound neutral and not quite managing it. Like physical files, boxes. I heard. Rachel. Kayla's voice dropped. She was 26, newer than most of the staff, still in the phase of her career where institutions felt like they ought to be trustworthy. How long have you known that there was something wrong with him? Rachel considered the question honestly. Since about week 3. Kayla stared at her. That was over a year ago. Yes. And you just stayed and documented it? What else would I do? Kayla didn't have an answer for that. She looked at Rachel the way several people had started looking at her in the last 2 hours, with a kind of recalibration happening behind the eyes. A reassessment of data that had been sitting in front of them and that they hadn't processed correctly because they'd been looking at the wrong category. Rachel understood it. She didn't need it, but she understood it. Well, the shift should have ended at 7. Nobody left. The day staff who'd been heading out when the helicopters landed had drifted back in 1s and 2s, pulled by the particular gravity of something happening. The overnight staff arrived and then stood at the edges of things, being briefed in fragments by the day staff, their faces doing the same work, recalibrating, reassessing. At 7:40, Cross made his move. Rachel was at the medication station when she heard his voice rise. Not the controlled authority voice he usually deployed, but something rawer and less managed. The voice of a man whose calculations had not produced a result he could work with, and who had decided that volume was the remaining tool available. This is obstruction, he was saying. He'd found Forsyth in the main corridor outside the administrative wing, and he'd brought Patterson with him, which suggested he'd decided witnesses were an asset. You do not have the authority to seize personnel records from a civilian medical facility without Dr. Cross. Forsyth's voice was the temperature of a room that had been unoccupied for a long time. I explained the warrant parameters to you 15 minutes ago. The authority question is resolved. Those records contain protected patient health information. The warrant specifies administrative personnel records and financial documentation. Patient health information is explicitly excluded. She looked at him with the mild patience of someone who had heard every version of this argument and had time to hear every future version as well. We've been quite careful. My attorney is welcome to contact the U.S. Attorney's Office directly. I have that number if you need it. Cross's jaw was working. He looked like a man trying to find a handhold on a surface that had been made deliberately smooth. I want it on record that I am protesting this action under— It is on record, Dr. Cross. Everything is on record tonight. She looked at him with something that was almost, not quite, but almost sympathy. That's the nature of federal investigations. Very thorough record-keeping. Patterson took a subtle half-step away from Cross. Rachel noticed. She thought Forsyth noticed too. Cross turned. He was scanning the corridor, the assembled faces of staff who'd gathered at various distances. Not crowding, just present, in the way that people are present when something is happening that they'll be talking about for years. His eyes moved and landed on Rachel, who was standing at the far end of the corridor near the medication station with a chart in her hands and no particular expression on her face. He walked toward her. People cleared from his path without quite meaning to. Not because they were deferring to him, the dynamic had shifted too much for that, but because whatever was about to happen between these two people felt like something that needed space around it. He stopped 6 feet from her. She didn't move. "You did this," he said. "Quiet now." The volume had burned off and left something underneath that was more honest than anything she'd heard from him in 14 months. "I don't know how long you've been... whatever you are, whatever this is, but you did this." "I documented the work environment," she said. "That's all." "Don't." His voice cracked slightly on the word. Not emotionally, more like something structural giving way. "Don't do the... just don't. You know what you did." She held his gaze. "Your patient today, Gerald Watts. Tension pneumo, left side, tracheal deviation. He's alive because someone in Bay 7 knew what they were looking at." She paused. "That's also in the record." He said nothing. "That's what I did, Dr. Cross. I did my job, every day, for 14 months. She looked at him steadily. "What did you do?" The question sat in the corridor between them like something solid. Cross held her gaze for 4 more seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward his office, passing Forsyth without looking at her, passing the assembled staff without looking at any of them, walking with the slightly mechanical quality of a man running entirely on the last reserves of something that was almost gone. Haskell appeared beside Rachel. "Nice," he said, quiet. "It wasn't meant to be." "I know." He watched Cross disappear around the corner. "He's going to try to access his private files before we secure them. He'll find they're already secured." She had flagged those specific directories to the system administrator 2 months ago, not locking them, just attaching silent monitoring that would log any access attempt. The system admin, a 40-year-old man named Torres, who had his own long and frustrated history with Cross's administrative overreach, had asked no questions and done exactly what she'd asked. "The access log from the last 40 minutes is already part of your warrant documentation." Haskell turned to look at her slowly. "You flagged his files 2 months ago." "I flagged the monitoring. That's different." "How is that?" He stopped, looked at her with an expression she recognized from years ago, from a debrief in a concrete building in a country she wasn't going to name, when she'd explained to him how she'd extracted intel from a situation that he'd believed was unworkable. The expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of a person he'd thought he already understood. "When did you know we were investigating?" "I didn't know specifically," she said, "but something had been running on the facility's financial records for about 6 weeks. Query patterns in the system logs, specific record requests that didn't correspond to any internal audit cycle. It was either federal or a hostile actor, and the query structure was federal." She shrugged slightly. "So I accelerated my timeline." Haskell was quiet for a moment. "You are genuinely unsettling sometimes. You put me in environments where unsettling was a survival skill." "Fair," he said. He looked back down the corridor. "Forsyth wants to talk to you formally. Recorded statement." "I know. After I finish my patient documentation." "Rachel." His voice changed slightly. Not the operational tone, something underneath it, something personal. "You didn't have to stay here. After everything, this kind of grinding it out in a place that treated you like someone had to. There were other hospitals. There were other patients," she said. "Here." She closed the chart. "I'm going to finish my documentation. Tell Forsyth an hour. Us." She finished in 47 minutes. Partly efficiency, partly the fact that she'd been preemptively maintaining meticulous records for so long that the formal documentation of tonight's events was largely a matter of organizing material that already existed in complete form. At 8:30, one of the tactical staff, a young sergeant named Owens, who had been the shoulder-wound patient and who had discharged himself against the mild protest of the overnight nursing staff and was now apparently serving as an informal liaison, found her in the break room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "Colonel says the second wave is en route," Owen said. She looked up. "Second wave?" "Inspector General's office, 3 more federal agents, and..." He paused in a way that suggested the next piece of information was being offered carefully. "Someone from the State Medical Licensing Board." Rachel set down the cold coffee. "How long?" 20 minutes, maybe 30. The Medical Licensing Board. She hadn't expected that tonight. She'd expected it in the follow-on, in the administrative aftermath that would unspool over weeks. The fact that it was arriving in the next half hour told her the federal investigation had flagged the licensing component earlier than she'd understood, and that someone above Forsyth's level had decided to move everything simultaneously, rather than let Cross use the gaps between processes to maneuver. It was, she thought, the right call. She would have made the same one. "Thank you, Owens," she said. He nodded and was gone. She sat with the cold coffee for another minute by herself in the break room that smelled like burned carafe and someone's forgotten lunch from earlier in the day. This was the part nobody saw in the version of events that would eventually get told. The part between the dramatic corridor confrontation and the arriving investigators, where a person sat alone with the mundane reality of what had actually happened and what was actually coming. She was tired. That was real and worth acknowledging. 14 months of operating at the level of vigilance she'd maintained, the documentation, the careful behavior modification required to stay in a hostile environment without giving them grounds to remove her before she was ready, took a toll that didn't show up in the moment, but showed up in a break room at 8:30 p.m. with a cup of cold coffee. She was also, and she sat with this more carefully because she was not always comfortable sitting with it, not entirely at peace with how tonight had gone. 9 people had been hurt in that convoy. Real people, real injuries, the kind that would leave physical and other marks long after the investigation wrapped up. Reyes was in recovery with a surgical drain and a long road in front of him. Whatever had happened 40 miles outside Briar Falls that afternoon had not been abstract. She knew better than most how connected things were, how institutional corruption didn't stay in its lane, how bad decisions in hospital administrative offices and bad decisions in operational planning rooms were often linked by money, by influence, by the kind of favor trading that happened at the level above where most people were permitted to look. Haskell had said the intel trail led back to this facility. She'd had 11 weeks to understand what that meant for him. She was still working out what it meant for her. The Inspector General's team arrived at 8:52. 3 agents, professional and unhurried, the kind of federal presence that didn't need to perform its authority because the authority was already resolved. They went directly to Forsyth. Brief conference. Handoff of materials. Rachel watched from the nursing station without watching, the way she always did. The licensing board representative came separately. A woman in her 50s named Dr. Miriam Voss, who had the specific quality of someone accustomed to arriving at scenes after the initial disaster and being required to make sense of them quickly. She introduced herself to the hospital's medical director, who had materialized sometime in the last hour, looking like he'd been woken from sleep and hadn't yet decided how to process being woken from sleep to this particular situation. Rachel's recorded statement with Forsyth happened in the small conference room off the administrative corridor at 9:15. She stated facts. She stated them in order. She referenced timestamps and documentation. She did not editorialize. She did not express emotion. She had given enough statements in enough formal settings to know that emotion in a statement was heard as instability, and instability was used by defense attorneys to construct doubt. Forsyth listened, recorded, asked 3 precise follow-up questions. She was good at this. Not warm, but fair, which Rachel respected more than warmth in a professional context. At 9:47, Rachel walked out of the conference room and nearly ran into Patterson, who was standing in the corridor with the look of a man who had been hovering near the conference room for an unknown period of time and who was now very aware of how that looked. "Ms. Morgan," he said. "Mr. Patterson." He was quiet for a moment. The hallway was empty except for the 2 of them and the distant sound of the ER, which had settled back into its ordinary rhythms, or as close to ordinary as tonight was going to get. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. He was genuinely uncomfortable, which she appreciated more than if he'd been smooth about it. Discomfort meant he understood something. "What for specifically?" she asked, because she wasn't going to let him do a general apology that covered everything without naming anything. He took the question seriously. "For not acting when staff raised concerns about Dr. Cross, for treating those concerns as," he paused, finding the accurate word rather than the comfortable one, "management problems, rather than patient safety problems." "That's accurate," she said. I should have. You should have, she agreed. But you didn't, and that's also documented, and I think you'll have the opportunity to discuss it with the Inspector General's team. She said it without particular heat. It was simply true. I'd recommend being as straightforward with them as you were just now with me. He nodded. He looked older than he had this afternoon. She didn't feel sorry about that exactly, but she didn't feel satisfied by it either. He was a man who had prioritized institutional stability over patient safety, which was common and corrosive and had consequences. But he wasn't Cross. The distinction mattered. She left him in the corridor and went back to the ER. At 10:23, the fire door at the end of the administrative corridor opened and Adrian Cross walked out of it. He was in street clothes. He'd changed, which meant he'd been planning this for at least an hour. And he was walking fast, not running, with the focused energy of a man who had made a decision and was executing it before he could think about it too hard. He made it approximately 40 feet before Owens fell into step beside him without apparent effort, as though the sergeant had been leaning against the wall at that exact spot for the past hour, for no particular reason. Dr. Cross, Owens said pleasantly, Special Agent Forsyth would like a word before you head out. I'm not under arrest, Cross said. I can leave. Absolutely, Owens said. Agent Forsyth is right this way. There was nothing overtly physical about what happened. Owens simply continued walking alongside Cross, maintaining the same easy pace, with the calm immovability of someone who has spent years moving through situations that require exactly this kind of controlled professional redirection. Cross slowed, stopped, looked at the exit door at the end of the corridor, then at Owens, then at the two additional figures who had materialized at the junction 20 feet ahead. She just wants to talk, Owens said. Cross's shoulders dropped about a quarter of an inch. Rachel was watching from the nursing station window that looked out into the corridor, standing at an angle that kept her mostly out of his sight line. She watched him turn and walk back with Owens toward the conference room. She watched the door close behind them. Her phone buzzed. Haskell. Text message, 4 words. He tried to run. She typed back, I know, I was watching, 3 seconds, then, of course you were. She put the phone in her pocket, went back to the ER. Somewhere in the building, in a conference room with a recording device and a federal agent, Adrian Cross was beginning to understand in specific and documented terms the exact dimensions of the situation he'd constructed for himself over years of decisions that he'd believed were private. They were not private. Almost nothing was private if you paid attention, if you documented carefully, if you stayed in a position where you could keep watching even when staying was the harder choice. She was pulling a replacement IV kit from the supply cart for Bay 4 when Deb Salazar appeared again, this time with an expression Rachel had not seen on her face before. Something that wasn't quite shock and wasn't quite vindication, something partway between them. They're arresting him, Deb said. Her voice had lost its usual wry steadiness. They're actually... She stopped, collected herself. Forsyth just came out of the conference room, and there are 2 agents with him, and she's reading him his rights, Rachel, right now, in the administrative corridor. Rachel stopped moving, just for a moment, one breath. Okay, she said. Okay? Deb stared at her. That's 14 months, and all you've got is okay? Rachel thought about it honestly. I'm tired, she said. I'm going to feel more things later. Right now I'm tired and I have a patient in Bay 4 who needs a new IV line. She picked up the kit and walked back toward the bays. Behind her, she heard Deb say quietly, to no one in particular, Who the hell is she? It was the right question, just about 5 hours too late. She was 3 steps from Bay 4 when her phone buzzed again. Haskell, this time a call, not a text. She stepped to the side of the corridor and answered. Morgan. His voice had changed. Not the operational calm or the personal undertone she'd heard earlier tonight. Something different, tighter, with an edge that she'd heard from him before in exactly 2 situations, both of which had involved rapidly developing information that altered the operational picture. The convoy investigation just produced something we weren't expecting. She held the phone closer. What? The ambush location. We've been running the site data. A pause, just long enough to be significant. Rachel, One of the triggering signals for the ambush, the communications intercept that positioned my convoy on that route at that time, it was generated from inside this building. She was very still. Someone in this hospital, Haskell said, helped set up the ambush that put 9 of my people in your ER tonight. The corridor was quiet around her. The ER hummed behind the partition. Somewhere in the administrative wing, Adrian Cross was in handcuffs. Cross? She asked. We don't know yet. His voice was careful. Maybe. But the signal origin is more specific than his office. It's narrower. She thought about Patterson in the hallway. She thought about the staff she'd cataloged and the staff she hadn't. She thought about 43 documented incidents and 1 transaction record and a USB drive she'd been carrying for 6 weeks. How narrow? She asked. A specific terminal, he said. In the ER. Another pause. In the nursing station. The sound of the ER came back to her all at once. The monitors, the voices, the ordinary ongoing business of a place trying to put itself back together after a night it hadn't been prepared for. She looked slowly down the corridor toward the nursing station where she'd been sitting all evening, where other people had also been sitting. Send me the timestamp, she said. The timestamp came through at 10:31 p.m. Rachel looked at it once, then looked up at the nursing station. 5:03 p.m. 17 minutes after the helicopters had landed. Right in the middle of the mass casualty response, when every supervisor was occupied, when the ER was loud and chaotic, and nobody was watching the station terminals because everybody was watching the stretchers coming through the doors. She thought about who had been at the nursing station at 5:03. She thought about it fast, because she'd been trained to reconstruct environments quickly, not to guess, but to pull from actual observation, actual memory, the catalog details that her brain had been accumulating and filing without being asked to. 5:03 p.m. She'd been at the second stretcher, the blast patient. Kayla had been running to get blood products. Deb had been in Bay 1. The unit secretary had stepped away from her desk to help with a supply cart. The station had not been empty. She scrolled the timestamp image on her phone. Haskell had sent a secondary file, a screen grab of the terminal access log, the specific machine ID, the user session that had been active. The session username was R. Salazar. Rachel stood very still in the corridor for a count of 3 seconds. Then she walked to the break room, checked that it was empty, stepped inside, and called Haskell back. Deb Salazar, she said when he picked up. We see it. I need you to be certain before you move. Deb has worked in this building for 22 years. She's the one who told me Cross called legal. She told me about the file access. If she's the source, Rachel stopped, organized her thinking. That behavior doesn't match someone covering their tracks. It matches someone managing information flow, controlling what I knew and when. Or it matches someone who miscalculated how fast we'd trace the terminal. Yes, she said. It was possible. Both things were possible simultaneously, and that was the problem. What does the signal data tell you? Content? Encrypted. We're working on it. But the routing confirms it was a communications intercept, the kind that requires knowing the specific operational channel the convoy was using. That's not public information. That's not something a hospital employee stumbles onto. Unless someone gave it to them. Cross, Haskell said. Or someone connected to Cross. She moved to the break room window. Through the glass she could see the main corridor, and at the far end of it, the nursing station, where Deb Salazar was currently standing with a chart in her hands, as though the last 6 hours had been a long and unusual shift rather than anything else. How do you want to handle it? Forsyth needs to know now. After that, it's her call. If you move on Deb publicly, in this building tonight, I know. She'll deny it. She's had 22 years to build credibility in this institution. Every nurse on this floor trusts her. Rachel, his voice was careful. That's Forsyth's problem to manage, not yours. She watched Deb through the glass. The woman was talking to one of the overnight nurses now. Normal conversation, body language loose, no sign of whatever was actually happening behind her eyes. Rachel had worked next to her for over a year. She trusted her assessments of Cross, her casual intelligence about administrative movements. Her 22 years of institutional knowledge freely shared with a newer colleague. Freely shared. Always available. Always accurate. Always useful. She was feeding me information, Rachel said quietly. Not to Haskell, to herself. Then to Haskell, she was controlling what I focused on, making sure I was pointed at Cross, only at Cross, while whatever else was running stayed out of my peripheral. We don't know that yet. I know it. She pulled herself back. But I understand. It's Forsyth's process. She took a breath. I'll stay visible and keep my normal pattern. Give Forsyth 20 minutes to position before anything overt. She hung up, stood in the break room for another 30 seconds, staring at the window, recalculating 14 months of interactions with a woman she'd believed was an ally. The thing that made her angriest, and she recognized it as anger specifically, not hurt, not betrayal, but a clean, cold fury, was not that she'd been managed. It was that it had worked. Partially. For a while. She went back to the ER. Forsyth moved at 10:51 p.m., and she moved precisely. 2 agents entered from the ambulance bay entrance simultaneously, with a third coming from the administrative corridor, and the geometry of it, 3 points of approach with no overlapping blind spots, told Rachel that Forsyth had been running tactical entry sequences long enough to do them without visible effort. It happened in under 90 seconds. No raised voices, no announcement. Deb Salazar looked up from her chart and found Dana Forsyth standing 18 inches away. "Mrs. Salazar," Forsyth said, "would you come with me, please?" It was not a question, but it was phrased as one, which was the specific choice of someone who understood that a clean arrest in a crowded ER required the subject to make one cooperative choice before anything else happened. Deb looked at Forsyth, then past her, at the 2 agents flanking the station, then across the room, and her eyes found Rachel. Rachel was standing at Bay 4's entrance with an IV kit in her hands, because she'd picked it up again and hadn't put it down, and she met Deb's gaze without expression or movement. Deb's face did something complicated, not guilt exactly, not fear exactly, the face of someone who had made a decision a long time ago and had lived with it long enough that the moment of reckoning, when it finally arrived, felt more like weather than consequence. Inevitable. Impersonal. "All right," Deb said. She set her chart down. She went with Forsyth. The room absorbed it. The overnight nurses, the attending physicians who were still present, the tactical staff along the walls. Everyone processed the same image at slightly different speeds. Deb Salazar, 22 years, the institutional memory of this floor, being walked quietly out of the ER by a federal agent. Kayla was at Rachel's elbow before she heard her coming. "What just... was that... I don't know the full picture yet," Rachel said, which was partially true. "She's being arrested?" "She's being questioned." Also partially true. "I need you to take Bay 4's IV line. Patient in there has been waiting too long." Kayla looked at her with the focused uncertainty of someone who needs a task. "Okay, yeah." She took the kit and went. Rachel stood at the bay entrance and let the noise of the ER fill in around the absence Deb had left. At 11:09, Haskell came to find her in the corridor near the trauma supply room, which was the spot in this building farthest from active traffic that still had sight lines to the main ER floor, a geography she'd identified in her first week and had used for private conversations several times since. He looked tired in a way he hadn't looked 3 hours ago, the kind of tired that wasn't physical. "The encryption broke faster than expected," he said. "The signal content. It was a route notification, saw real-time positioning of our convoy, transmitted out of this building to a relay that we've now traced to a private security contractor operating out of..." He stopped himself. "You don't need the full chain tonight." "Deb had the operational channel frequency," Rachel said. "That came from Cross. Cross's financial records confirm 4 wire transfers over 18 months to a numbered account that traces, through 2 shells, to the same contractor." He said it flatly. "We think Cross was being paid to delay emergency medical response to specific cases, military cases, contractors, certain federal employees, cases where the delay wouldn't look like delay. It would look like inadequate civilian medical care." Rachel processed that. He wasn't just obstructing care for ego. His ego made it convenient. But no, Haskell's jaw was tight. The malpractice pattern, the altered records, the complaints that went nowhere, some of that was Cross protecting Cross. And some of it was Cross being protected because he was useful. And Deb was the communications link. Looks like it. She had access to everything in this building: staff schedules, patient intake, operational movements of anyone admitted here with a military or federal connection. He looked at the floor briefly. She's been doing it for at least 3 years. 3 years. Rachel thought about that. 3 years of Deb Salazar knowing which patients to steer where, which information to surface and which to suppress, which nurse's complaint would get traction and which would quietly disappear, which new hire to manage. She recruited me, Rachel said. Not a question. Haskell was quiet for a beat. We don't know that word is... She was at the nursing home fair where I applied. She called the reference I'd listed, Dr. Tanner, my last commanding medical officer. She told him this was a good facility, stable environment. Rachel's voice stayed even. She positioned me to come here. Haskell looked at her directly. Rachel, if I was already documented as a decorated combat medic who'd been quietly separated from service, I was exactly what Cross needed adjacent to him. Someone with credentials he could claim credit for, who he could also credibly destroy if she got in the way. She stopped, restarted. She didn't recruit me to help them. She recruited me to be a controlled variable. The corridor was very quiet. You weren't controlled, Haskell said. No, she said. I wasn't. She pushed off the wall. But she couldn't have known that. She read my file and saw someone who'd been quietly pushed out of service and needed a stable position. She couldn't have known what I'd do with 14 months of access. Nobody could have predicted that, he said. Something in his voice was different. Not the colonel, not the operational commander. Something older than rank. What you built here, the documentation, the monitoring, Rachel, what you did here is not normal, even for people with your background. Patients were being hurt, she said, simply. As though that explained everything, which for her it did. He looked at her for a moment, then, Forsyth is going to need a formal statement about your interactions with Salazar. Everything, from the referral forward. I know, tomorrow morning. She started toward the ER. Tonight I have patients, and sat. She was suturing a laceration in Bay 2 at 11:44 when Patterson appeared in the doorway with the careful demeanor of a man who had spent the last 2 hours in conversations he hadn't anticipated and had emerged from them with a new and specific understanding of his own position. She kept her eyes on the suture line. Not now, Mr. Patterson. Yes, of course. He didn't leave. She heard him shift his weight. The board is convening an emergency session tomorrow morning, given the scope of what's come forward tonight. Dr. Voss from the licensing board has already been in contact with our legal team. A pause. There's a question of interim leadership for the trauma division. She tied off the suture, snipped, applied the dressing with the economical motion of someone who had closed wounds in conditions that made this exam table look like a dream. I'm a nurse, Mr. Patterson. Yes, he said. We know that. Something in his tone made her look up. He was holding a folder, a thin one, not administrative bulk, just a few pages. He set it on the counter beside her with the care of someone placing something fragile. Dr. Voss suggested a temporary clinical oversight structure while the board determines permanent trauma leadership. Another pause. Your name came up. Rachel looked at the folder, looked at Patterson. My name, she said. Specifically and without hesitation, he said. From Dr. Voss, from Colonel Haskell, and from 3 of the attending physicians who were in this ER tonight. His discomfort had shifted into something that was trying to be direct and nearly achieving it. We handled this wrong, for a long time. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm telling you what the board is considering. She turned back to her patient, an 18-year-old with a skateboarding injury who had been watching this exchange with the focused interest of a teenager who understood something significant was happening even if he couldn't name it. You doing okay? She asked him. Yeah, he said. He looked at Patterson, then back at her. You should take it, whatever it is. She almost smiled. I'll look at the folder, she told Patterson, after my shift. Patterson nodded and left. The folder sat on the counter. Rachel finished her post-suture instructions, walked her patient to the discharge area, and came back to find Haskell standing at the counter looking at the folder without touching it. He told you? She asked. Voss called me directly. She wanted military confirmation of your clinical record. He was still looking at the folder. I gave her 2 hours of it. 2 hours. I may have been thorough. She picked up the folder, opened it, read the first page, which outlined a proposed interim structure with specific language about scope of authority and clinical oversight parameters. Read the second page, which listed the names of staff who had submitted supporting statements, 12 names, overnight staff, and day shift both. People who had made those statements in the last 2 hours while everything else was also happening. 12 people. Some of whom had not spoken directly to her in 14 months. She closed the folder. I need to think about it, she said. I know. That's not a no. I know that too. He paused. There's one more thing. The CID follow-on report, the contractor chain we traced from Cross's payments. It goes wider than Briar Falls. 3 other facilities in 2 other states, same pattern. Military-adjacent cases, delayed care, altered documentation. He looked at her. Forsyth's team is going to be in this building for weeks, and then they're going to move to the other facilities. Rachel was quiet. They could use someone, Haskell said carefully, who knows how to be in an institution like this. Who knows what to look for? Who can operate in a civilian medical environment and recognize when something is wrong before the bodies start telling you? She looked at him. You're asking me to do this again? I'm asking if you'd consider a formalized version of what you've been doing for 14 months, while running interim trauma oversight for this ER. The positions aren't mutually exclusive. The CID component would be, he stopped himself. We can talk about this properly when you're not working. She was quiet for a moment. Through the glass partition, she could see the ER floor, the ordinary nighttime rhythm of it, the monitors and the movement and the small dramas of people in pain being helped by people who had chosen to help them. It was a flawed system. It was full of human failure and institutional rot and the specific damage that power did when it went unchecked. It also saved lives every day, including tonight, 9 specific lives that were currently sleeping in hospital beds with IV lines and surgical drains and the reasonable expectation of waking up tomorrow. She looked at the folder. At Haskell, at the ER. I said I'd think about it, she said. I'm thinking. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Forsyth. The text was 4 words. Salazar is talking. Come now. Rachel looked at Haskell. He'd seen the screen. Go, he said. She went. Down the corridor past the nursing station where Deb's chart was still sitting exactly where she'd set it before Forsyth walked her out. Past the administrative wing, to the conference room at the end of the hall, where light was coming under the door. She pushed it open. Forsyth was at the table. 2 agents were against the wall. Deb Salazar was sitting in the center chair with her hands folded in front of her, and her 22 years of careful composure finally visibly cracking at the edges. And across from Deb, in a chair that nobody had put there for him, was Patterson. He looked at Rachel when she came in, then at Forsyth. I asked to be present, he said before anyone could ask, because what she's about to say involves me, and I'd rather you hear my response in real time than read it in a statement tomorrow. Forsyth looked at Rachel, a question she wasn't saying out loud. Rachel looked at Patterson, then Deb, then Forsyth. All right, Rachel said. Deb raised her eyes. For the first time since 10:51, she looked directly at Rachel. Her expression was not what Rachel expected. Not defiant, not guilty, not calculating, just tired. The profound, specific exhaustion of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally, at 11:53 p.m. on the worst night of several people's lives, put it down. There's a name you don't have yet, Deb said. Her voice was steady. Whatever she'd decided in the last hour, she'd decided it completely. Above Cross. Above the contractor. She looked at the table. Someone who told me 3 years ago that you, specifically you, Rachel, were going to eventually show up in a facility like this, that your service record made you a liability, that you needed to be placed somewhere manageable. She stopped. I believe them. I shouldn't have. She looked up. The name is Harlan Vance. The room was silent. Rachel didn't recognize the name. She looked at Forsyth, whose face had just done something very controlled and very small that meant she did. Say it again, Forsyth said quietly. Harlan Vance, Deb repeated. Forsyth stood up from the table, stepped out of the room, and closed the door behind her. Through the conference room glass, Rachel watched her pull out her phone with the specific urgency of someone who needed to reach a level above her own. Forsyth was on the phone for 11 minutes. Rachel knew because she was watching the clock on the conference room wall, the way she'd learned to track time in environments where time was the variable that mattered most. 11 minutes with the door closed, her voice inaudible through the glass, her body language doing the specific thing it did when she was listening to someone above her pay grade rather than speaking. Inside the room, nobody talked. Patterson sat with his hands flat on the table. Deb stared at the middle distance. The two agents against the wall maintained the professional stillness of people trained to be furniture when the situation required it. Rachel stood near the door and thought about the name. Harlan Vance. She ran it through every context she had: military, medical, administrative, the long catalog of names that accumulated over a career in environments where knowing who was connected to whom could determine whether you came home. Nothing. The name produced no file, no face, no operational context, which was itself information. She knew a lot of names. The ones she didn't know were either minor or very deliberately kept out of the spaces she'd occupied. Forsyth came back in at 12:04 a.m. She sat down. She set her phone face down on the table, which was a small gesture that meant the conversation that had just happened was not going to be discussed openly. Ms. Salazar, she said, I need everything you have on Vance, not impressions, specifics, dates, communication methods, what he knew about this facility, and when, who else in this network had direct contact with him. Deb nodded. She looked smaller than she had at 10:51, not broken, more like something had been resolved in her that had been unresolved for a long time. And the resolution, even this kind, was a form of relief. I can give you 2 years of it, maybe more if you give me access to a personal account I maintain off-site. We'll arrange that. Forsyth looked at her agents. Get the tech team in here. She looked at Patterson. Mr. Patterson, I need you to step out. You can give your statement to Agent Morrow in room B. Patterson stood. He paused at the door, looked at Rachel with the expression of a man who had several things he wanted to say and understood that none of them were appropriate to the moment. He left. Forsyth looked at Rachel last. You should go home. I'm still on shift. Your shift ended. Forsyth checked her watch. 90 minutes ago. Rachel looked at Deb, who was now being approached by a tech agent with a laptop. Deb didn't look back. Whatever was happening between the two of them was finished, not resolved, just completed. The thing it had been was over, and neither of them had a useful framework for what came after. I'll be in the ER, Rachel said. Mom. She stayed until 2:15 a.m., not because there was critical work. The overnight staff had things managed. The military patients were stable. The controlled chaos of earlier had settled into the ordinary hum of a night shift finding its rhythm. She stayed because leaving felt wrong in a way she couldn't quite articulate, as though removing herself from the building before it had processed everything that had happened would leave something unfinished. She discharged 2 patients, updated 3 charts, replaced a dressing on Sergeant Reyes, who was awake and uncomfortable and wanted to know when he could call his wife. When the duty officer clears it, she told him, that could be days. It could be an hour. I don't make that call. She smoothed the edge of the dressing. The surgery went well. You'll have full function. He looked at her. He was 23, with the kind of face that still had some softness in it that the years hadn't taken yet. You're the one who triaged us when we came in. Yes. I was conscious enough to see some of it. He paused. Castellano, the guy with the abdominal wound, He wasn't going to make it if they'd waited another 10 minutes. He's in recovery, she said. He's fine. Because of you. She pulled off her gloves. Because of a surgical team that operated well under pressure and a supply chain that had the right blood products available. I did triage. That's a first step. You're doing the thing where you deflect credit, he said. She looked at him. You've known me for about 6 hours. Yeah, but Haskell talks about you like you hung the moon, and you clearly hate that, which tells me you do this every time someone tries to acknowledge. Get some sleep, Sergeant Reyes. Yes, ma'am. He settled back, almost smiled. Haskell's going to offer you something big. I heard the staff talking. You should take it. She turned off his bedside light and left the bay. She drove home at 2:30 a.m. and sat in her car in the parking lot of her building for about 4 minutes before going inside. The apartment was the same as she'd left it. Spare, functional, the filing cabinet in the spare room with its 43 documented incidents that were no longer a private archive but evidence in a federal case. She made tea she didn't drink. Sat at the kitchen table for a while looking at nothing in particular. The thing about days like this, and she'd had days like this before, just not in hospitals, was that the aftermath was never what you expected. You spent so long in the operational mode, the focused problem-solving mode, that when it was over, the transition was abrupt and the silence felt wrong. Her hands were steady. They were always steady during. It was after, in the quiet, that things surfaced. She thought about Deb Salazar. She thought about 22 years of institutional knowledge deployed carefully against the people it appeared to serve. She thought about the specific craft of it, the way Deb had positioned herself as the building's memory, the safe source, the person who told you which way the wind was blowing. How long had that taken to build? How many people had been managed by it before Rachel arrived? How many complaints had been quietly redirected, not by Cross but by Deb, by the simple mechanism of telling people where to look so they wouldn't look somewhere else? She thought about Harlan Vance and the way Forsyth had gone outside to make a phone call. She slept for 4 hours. Badly. She was back at Riverstone by 8 a.m., which was not required but felt necessary. The building in daylight looked the same as it always did. The glass entrance, the parking lot with its marked ambulance lanes, the lobby with its framed photographs of medical staff and its slightly dated potted plants. Normal. Institutional. The same building it had been yesterday morning. Nothing looked like what had happened inside it the night before. The ER day shift was already running when she came through the department doors. Some faces registered surprise, others something more complex. Kayla was at the nursing station and stood up when she saw Rachel, which was not a thing she normally did. You came back, Kayla said. I work here. I know, I just... She stopped. Started again. Dr. Voss from the licensing board is upstairs. She's been here since 7. And there are 2 people from the Inspector General's office in the administrative wing, and Patterson sent an all-staff email at 6 a.m. She held out her phone. Rachel read the email. It was 3 paragraphs, formal language, precise. It acknowledged an ongoing federal investigation, confirmed that Dr. Adrian Cross had been placed on indefinite administrative suspension pending review, confirmed that the hospital was cooperating fully with all relevant authorities. The 3rd paragraph stated that interim clinical oversight for the trauma division was being established effective immediately and that details would follow. It did not name Rachel, but it didn't need to. The overnight staff had been here. The day shift had received briefings. She handed the phone back. Bay assignments? Kayla blinked. Same as usual. 4 through 7 are yours. Okay. Rachel moved toward the bays. Rachel. Kayla's voice stopped her. Are you all right? Rachel considered the question honestly, which was a thing she didn't always do with people who asked it. I'm tired, she said. But, yes. Okay. Kayla looked like she had more to say, and was choosing not to. Okay. Bays 4 through 7. The call from Forsyth came at 9:47. Rachel took it in the hallway near the trauma supply room. The same spot, the same sightlines. Pattern of behavior. She noticed herself doing it and filed it away as something to examine later. We've got a problem, Forsyth said. No preamble. Vance's legal team filed an injunction at 7 this morning. Preemptive motion to suppress, based on a claim that Salazar's statement was obtained under duress. Was it? No, we were by the book, every step. But the injunction buys time, and Vance has a lot of resources and very good lawyers who know exactly how to use procedural tools to slow an investigation. A pause. More specifically, they're arguing that the terminal access evidence is inadmissible because of how the monitoring was established. They're claiming the flag you put on those directories constitutes unauthorized surveillance. Rachel was quiet for a moment. I flagged the monitoring through the hospital's own IT system administrator, within my authorized access level, for patient safety reasons. I know, but the argument is that your actual purpose was investigative, not clinical, which would require a different authorization framework. Forsyth's voice was careful. It's a thin argument, probably doesn't survive a competent federal judge, but thin arguments in front of the right judge with the right timing can move a lot of pieces. What does this do to Cross? Cross's situation is separately established. His financial records, the wire transfers, Salazar's statement, which is documented and time-stamped, he's not getting out from under that regardless of the Vance injunction. He's done. A beat. This is specifically about Vance, about whether we can use the terminal evidence to establish his connection to the network. Rachel thought, the terminal evidence proves the signal came from this building at a specific time from a specific session. Salazar's statement establishes the chain above that. If the terminal evidence is suppressed, then Salazar's statement becomes the primary link, and Vance's attorneys will argue it's uncorroborated and coerced. What do you need from me? Your formal statement about the IT flagging, detailed, specific, with the clinical rationale documented clearly, and anything in your records that references the directories you flagged, and why. Rachel thought about the filing cabinet in her spare room, about 43 documented incidents, about the specific entry from 2 months ago when she'd asked Torres to flag the monitoring and the reason she'd entered in her personal log at the time. I documented it, she said. Of course you did, Forsyth said, something in her voice that was almost warmth. Get it to me by noon. She drove home on her break, retrieved 3 specific pages from the filing cabinet, drove back, and was in Forsyth's temporary office by 11:20. The pages showed 2 months of documentation establishing a pattern of unauthorized directory access by non-clinical administrative personnel, cross-accessing nursing staff files outside of any HR review process, specific timestamps, specific concerns about patient data privacy that had motivated her to request monitoring. Forsyth read them without speaking, then read them again. You documented the clinical rationale at the time of the request, she said. Yes? 2 months before any of last night's events. Yes. Forsyth looked up. This is going to hold, she said. The injunction won't survive this. She set the pages down. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. All right. When you flagged that monitoring bit, did you know at that point that there was a federal investigation running? Rachel met her gaze. No. I knew something was running in the facility's financial query logs that looked federal in structure. I didn't know specifically. What I knew specifically was that Cross was accessing personnel directories that he had no clinical reason to access, and that those directories contained information about nursing staff, including me, that had no legitimate administrative use. She paused. I was protecting my colleagues' privacy records. That was the documented reason. It was also the real reason. But you suspected more. I always suspect more, Rachel said. That's not a skill I can turn off. Forsyth studied her. No, she said. I imagine it isn't. At 1:30 p.m., Adrian Cross was formally charged. Rachel heard about it the way most of the hospital staff heard about it, not through any official announcement, but through the specific physics of institutional information, which moved faster than any memo. Someone saw the federal vehicle in the parking lot. Someone else recognized the U.S. Attorney's Office representative who came in through the administrative entrance. Word moved from the administrative wing, through the attendings lounge, through the nursing staff, through the ER in approximately 22 minutes. The charges, as they filtered through, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to interfere with military medical operations, and 2 counts related to the falsification of medical records in patient deaths. That last part landed differently than the rest. It wasn't abstract institutional misconduct. It was 2 specific people who had not gotten care they should have received. Rachel was in Bay 6 when she heard the list. She finished the assessment she was doing, documented it, and then stood at the bedside of her patient, a 60-year-old woman with a kidney stone who had been waiting for pain management and who was watching Rachel's face with the sharp attention of someone who could tell that something significant was happening nearby. "Everything okay?" the woman asked. "Yes," Rachel said. "I'm going to get your medication order in now. 10 minutes. She meant it. Whatever else was happening in this building, there was a woman in Bay 6 who was in pain and who needed someone to handle the next step. She handled the next step. Cross was escorted out at 2:14 p.m. Rachel didn't plan to watch. She was at the nursing station updating charts when the sound changed in the ER. Not louder, actually quieter. The particular hush that happens when people become collectively aware of something and stop performing their normal movements. She looked up. Through the glass partition that faced the main corridor, she could see the administrative hallway. Cross was walking between 2 federal agents, not in handcuffs, not yet, not here, those would come at processing, but with the specific quality of a man who understood that the people on either side of him were not escorts in any optional sense. He was in his civilian clothes again. He looked like himself, which was the strange part. The silver hair, the broad-shouldered posture, the face that had graced the hospital's promotional materials and lobby plaque. He looked like the chief of trauma surgery of Riverstone Medical Center, which he no longer was, which he would never be again. He didn't look at Rachel as he passed. She thought he was going to not look at her, and then at the last moment, through the glass, his eyes moved. Found her at the nursing station, held for maybe 2 seconds. She didn't look away. Didn't change her expression. She simply looked back at him the way she'd been looking at him for 14 months, clearly, without flinching, with the specific quality of someone who has never once been uncertain about what they were seeing. He looked away first. The automatic doors at the end of the corridor opened. He walked through them. He was gone. The ER exhaled. People resumed their movements. Monitors beeped. Somewhere in the building, someone's pager went off with the ordinary urgency of an ordinary emergency, and 3 people moved to handle it. Kayla was beside Rachel. She didn't say anything. Rachel didn't say anything. They stood at the nursing station for about 5 seconds in a silence that was not uncomfortable, and then Kayla picked up a chart and went back to work, and Rachel picked up a chart and went back to work. The applause started in the attendings lounge at 3 p.m. Rachel didn't know it was happening until she walked past the lounge door on her way to the pharmacy corridor. The door was open, and there were 8, maybe 10 physicians inside. Some she knew by name, some she'd only encountered in the passing geography of shared hallways. And when she appeared in the doorway, they looked up, and then one of them started, and then the others. It was not a long thing, maybe 15 seconds. One of the attendings, Dr. Priya Nair, infectious disease, who had been at Riverstone for 9 years and who had never, to Rachel's knowledge, shown any particular interest in the nursing staff, started it, and the others followed. And it was the slightly awkward applause of people who were acknowledging something they didn't fully know how to frame. Rachel stood in the doorway and let it happen, because stopping it would have been its own kind of performance, and she was tired of performance. When it stopped, Nair said, "For what it's worth, I should have listened 2 years ago when a patient flagged concerns about his care. I didn't." She said it simply, without the elaborate disclaimers that people sometimes attach to admissions like that. "I'm sorry. I appreciate that," Rachel said, meaning it, but also aware that sorry was the beginning of something, not the end. "If you have documentation from 2 years ago, Forsyth's team should have it." Nair nodded. "I'll call her this afternoon." Rachel went to the pharmacy corridor. Haskell found her in the stairwell at 4:15, which was not a normal place to have a conversation, but which was where she'd gone to eat a granola bar in peace, which was not something she'd managed to do since this time yesterday. He sat on the step below hers without asking, which was fine. "Vance's injunction failed," he said. She swallowed the last of the granola bar. When? An hour ago. Federal judge in the Eastern District denied it in 15 minutes. Said the documentation of the monitoring's clinical purpose was unambiguous. He looked at his hands. Forsyth's team is moving on Vance tonight. Rachel was quiet. She thought about a name she hadn't recognized and what it meant that someone powerful enough to require an 11-minute phone call and a pre-dawn injunction had been running a network that included a chief trauma surgeon and a 22-year hospital veteran, and that the whole thing had been threaded through institutions designed to protect people, using those institutions' own structures as cover. How many facilities? She asked. Vance's network? We're still mapping it, at least 6, possibly more. Different states, different specialties. He paused. All with the same basic architecture. A senior physician with something to protect, a long-term staff member with deep institutional access, and a filtering mechanism that kept certain patients from receiving certain care. And Vance is, what? The architect? The contractor. Someone runs above him probably, but Vance is the operational layer, and he's who we can get with what we have. Haskell looked up at the stairwell ceiling. It's not everything. It's not the whole thing. Cases like this never give you the whole thing at once. No, she said, they don't. They sat in the stairwell for a moment. Somewhere above them, the hospital went on doing what hospitals did. The position Forsyth and I discussed, Haskell said. I want to be clear about what I'm actually asking because I was vague last night and that wasn't fair. He turned to look at her. I'm asking you to become part of a formal joint program, CID, and civilian medical oversight, identifying compromised facilities before the pattern reaches a criminal threshold. Preventive, not reactive. A pause. Based here, while Riverstone rebuilds, but mobile when the work requires it. Rachel looked at the granola bar wrapper in her hands. Military authority? Civilian contract. You'd report to CID, but your standing in civilian facilities would be as a medical professional with investigative credentials, not as a soldier. I'm not a soldier anymore. No, he said. You're something harder to categorize, which is exactly why the program needs you. She thought about 6 other facilities, about patients in those facilities who were maybe already receiving the wrong thing, the delayed thing, the modified thing, and who didn't know it. About the specific patients required to be in an institution for the weeks and months it took to see the pattern clearly, about how much she hated that she was good at this, and how little that hatred changed the fact that she was. I'll need the formal proposal, she said, in writing, with scope defined clearly. Done. And I need to finish rebuilding this department before I'm mobile. Understood. And Patterson doesn't get to use my presence here as a PR cleanup for the board's negligence. If I take the interim role, I have actual authority, not a title. I'll make sure Voss is explicit about that. Those are preconditions, not a yes. I know. He stood, looked down at her. Take the time you need. She looked at the wrapper, folded it. Haskell. He stopped. Deb Salazar knew my service record, she said, knew it well enough to know that placing me here would keep me pointed at one target. She knew what I was capable of, and she factored it into the design. She looked up at him. Who else knows my file that well, outside of official channels? Haskell was very still. Vance accessed it, he said quietly. We found the query in the Defense Personnel Records System 14 months ago, 3 days before Salazar made contact with your reference. Rachel absorbed that. He knew who I was before I walked through the door, she said. Yes. And he placed me here anyway. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. A man who knew exactly who she was had decided to put her in a hospital with a corrupt surgeon and a handler who would keep her focused on the surgeon, which meant he'd believed that even with her specific background and capabilities, the environment would contain her, that the institution would be enough. He'd been wrong. But the fact that he'd made the calculation at all, the fact that her file had been accessed and assessed and incorporated into someone's operational planning, meant that she had been a known variable in someone else's game for longer than last night, longer than 14 months. You knew this before tonight, she said. Haskell's pause was the answer. You knew he'd accessed my file, she said, That's part of why you brought the convoy here specifically. You needed me to be here, on the record, doing exactly what I did, so that the case against Vance included my testimony. Because I'm not just a witness. I'm evidence of what his network tried to do with me and couldn't. Haskell didn't deny it. He looked at her with the expression she'd seen twice before. The debrief expression, the recalibration expression. Except this time it was different. This time it was something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like genuine discomfort. I need you to understand, he said, that I did not put my people in that convoy as a calculated, I know, she said. The convoy was real. The ambush was real. But the choice to come to this facility, you made that choice knowing that Vance had flagged my file, knowing what it would mean if I was on record here tonight. The stairwell was very quiet. Yes, he said, finally, completely. She stood up. They were the same height on the stairs, nearly eye level. She looked at him for a long moment, the way she looked at things she was trying to understand from the inside out rather than the surface. The proposal, she said, I want a clause in it. No one, not CID, not the IG's office, not anyone in your chain, uses my presence in a facility as operational cover without my explicit knowledge and consent, ever. That's not a preference. That's the condition the whole thing stands on. He held her gaze. Yes, he said, that's fair. It's not about fair, she said. It's about the thing not working if I don't control my own positioning. You know that. I know that, he said. She went past him up the stairs. At the landing, she stopped. Tell Forsyth I'll give a full statement on the Vance file access tomorrow morning, she said. Everything I know about the timeline, including what you just told me. Rachel, it goes in the record, Haskell. All of it. She looked down at him. That's how this works. All of it in the record. He nodded. She pushed through the stairwell door and went back to work. Done. At 5:45 p.m., Forsyth's team arrested Harlan Vance. Rachel wasn't there. She was in the ER, managing the ordinary late afternoon surge, a kid with a broken collarbone, an elderly man with an arrhythmia that needed monitoring, a young woman in the early stages of a severe allergic reaction who'd made it in just in time. She found out about the arrest the same way she'd found out about everything tonight, through the particular grapevine of an institution processing a crisis, information arriving in fragments and assembling itself into a picture. Vance, as the picture assembled itself, was not a dramatic figure. He was 58, a former defense contractor executive who had transitioned into private medical consulting 12 years ago, who sat on 3 hospital advisory boards and 2 government health committees, who had given money to 3 university research programs and had his name on a wing of a children's hospital in another state. He was, by all visible evidence, an unremarkable man in a well-tailored suit who had spent 12 years building a network that treated the medical care of specific categories of patient as a variable to be managed. He was arrested in his office. He did not resist. According to the account that reached Rachel third hand from a CID liaison, who told Owens, who told Kayla, who told Rachel while handing her a chart, he'd been sitting behind his desk when the agents came in, and when Forsyth read the charges, he'd looked at her and said, I'd like to call my attorney. Not denying it, not performing innocence, just moving to the next procedural step. Rachel thought about that for a while. The specific coldness of it, not panic, not collapse, just the efficient engagement of the next resource. The posture of someone who had always believed the system was a tool and was still, even now, trying to use it. She also thought about the fact that someone ran above him. Forsyth had said Vance was the operational layer. She'd said it carefully, with the specific precision of someone choosing their words because the words mattered. At 6:30 p.m., as Rachel was finishing her second-to-last chart of the day, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The area code was Washington, D.C., Dr. Morgan. We need to speak, not through official channels. This is not a threat. It is the opposite. There is a name above Vance that Forsyth doesn't have yet. And the reason she doesn't have it is because 3 of the people who could give it to her are already dead. I have documentation. I need a safe point of contact. You are being recommended as that contact by someone you trust. T. Rachel read the text twice, put her phone in her pocket, finished the chart, picked the phone back up, typed one word. Who recommended me? The reply came in 40 seconds. Salazar. She stared at the word on her screen for a long moment. Salazar. Deb, who is currently in federal custody, giving a recorded statement to Forsyth's team in a conference room 2 floors up. Deb, who had spent 3 years managing information flow for a network that treated patients as collateral. Deb, who had looked at Rachel across that conference room table with the exhausted, specific expression of someone putting down something heavy. Deb had recommended her as a safe contact for someone with documentation on a name that sat above Harlan Vance. Rachel thought about that carefully. She thought about it the way she'd been trained to think about things that arrived with urgency and credibility attached. Not with immediate acceptance, not with immediate rejection, but with the flat analytical patience of someone who knew that the most effective manipulations came dressed as the thing you most wanted to be true. She typed, "How do I verify you?" 41 seconds. Then a file came through. A photograph of a signed document, the kind of administrative paperwork that existed in the unremarkable paper trail of institutional life. It was a personnel transfer authorization from 8 years ago for a position in a federal health oversight committee. The signature at the bottom was Harlan Vance's. The name at the top of the document, the person being transferred, was someone Rachel didn't recognize. But in the bottom corner of the document, in the small box labeled Secondary Authorization, was a second signature, and under it, a name. She knew that name. She went directly to Forsyth's temporary office without calling ahead. She knocked once and walked in. Forsyth looked up from her laptop. She registered Rachel's expression and closed the laptop. What happened? Rachel handed her the phone. Forsyth read the text exchange. Read it again. Looked at the photograph of the document. Her face did the small, controlled thing it had done when Deb said Vance's name. That micro-movement of someone absorbing a significant data point and immediately beginning to process its implications. When did this come in? She asked. 20 minutes ago. I finished my chart first. Rachel sat in the chair across from her. The secondary signature on that document, you know it. Yes. Forsyth set the phone on the desk between them. Senator Merrick Dolan, Senate Subcommittee on Federal Health Infrastructure. She was quiet for a moment. He's been on that subcommittee for 11 years. He has oversight authority over exactly the kinds of federal medical contracts that Vance's network was manipulating. He didn't just have oversight authority, Rachel said. He had the ability to ensure that investigations into those contracts went nowhere or got redirected. Yes. And 3 people who could have named him are dead. Forsyth looked at the phone. This contact, T, claims documentation. Claims it. I have no way to verify the substance yet. Rachel paused. But the document they sent is real. The secondary signature is real. And Deb Salazar, who is currently in your custody and has every reason to give you everything she has, apparently knows this person well enough to give them my name as a safe contact. Forsyth picked up her own phone. I need to verify Salazar's awareness of this before I do anything else. She stood. Stay here. She was gone for 19 minutes. Rachel sat in the office and looked at the middle distance and thought about the specific geometry of what was happening. How cases like this had a tendency to keep opening, like a set of doors where behind each one was another corridor, another door. You could spend a career walking through them. Forsyth came back. She sat. She looked like she'd resolved something. Salazar confirmed the contact, she said. She wouldn't give the name, but she confirmed the person exists, that they've been trying to surface Dolan's involvement for 2 years, and that they came to Salazar 6 months ago for a way into the network. A pause. Salazar didn't give them access, but she kept the contact. She said she kept it because she wasn't, her words, she wasn't sure anymore. 6 months ago, she started being not sure. Rachel let that sit. 6 months ago, Deb had started being uncertain, and instead of acting on that uncertainty, she had sat with it and kept doing what she was doing and kept managing Rachel and kept transmitting signals out of nursing station terminals. And people had gotten hurt in a convoy 40 miles outside Briar Falls. The arithmetic of delayed conscience was always brutal. I'll respond, Rachel said, as myself, as the contact. but under your supervision, with everything documented. That's exactly what I was going to ask, Forsyth said. The contact, T, turned out to be a woman named Teresa Okwu. 51 years old, former senior analyst with the Government Accountability Office, who had been quietly building a file on Senator Dolan's financial relationship with Vance's network for 26 months, and who had watched two colleagues who'd been working the same thread die in what had been ruled accidents, and a third retire abruptly under circumstances she considered neither voluntary nor coincidental. She came to Riverstone Medical Center 4 days later, on a Tuesday morning, in a gray sedan, with a laptop bag and a flash drive, and the particular bearing of someone who had been living carefully for a long time. Rachel met her in the hospital's small conference room. Not Forsyth's temporary office, not a police station, not a federal building. Here, on neutral ground, in the building where Rachel's own credibility was now institutional record. Okwu shook Rachel's hand and sat down and looked at her with a kind of frank assessment that Rachel recognized and respected. "You're smaller than I expected," Okwu said. "I get that a lot," Rachel said. Okwu almost smiled, opened her laptop. For the next 4 hours, with Forsyth present and recording and 2 additional agents in the building but not in the room, Teresa Okwu laid out 26 months of documented evidence connecting Senator Merrick Dolan to Vance's network through a series of federal contract modifications, committee decisions, and 2 specific votes that had defunded oversight mechanisms for the exact type of medical service manipulation that Vance had been running. The documentation was not perfect. It had gaps, assumptions, circumstantial links that would need corroboration. But at its core was something solid and specific, a wire transfer record, traced through a lobbying intermediary, from a Vance-connected shell entity to a campaign finance vehicle that existed to benefit Dolan's re-election, timed within 72 hours of a committee vote that had quietly buried a GAO audit into federal health contractor accountability. Forsyth went through it with the systematic attention of someone building a prosecution timeline. Rachel said almost nothing. She sat and listened and tracked the shape of it and understood gradually the full architecture, how it had been designed to be invisible from any single vantage point, how you needed to be standing in several places at once to see the whole thing, how Vance had understood that and had built his network accordingly. He'd miscalculated on Rachel because he'd assumed that placing her in a contained environment would keep her vision narrow. He hadn't understood that her specific training, the thing that made her valuable to him as a controlled variable, was also the thing that made her impossible to contain. She didn't look at situations from a single position. She never had. When Okwu finished, Forsyth closed her notepad. "This is enough to open a formal investigation at the Senate level," she said. "That goes above my office. Way above." She looked at Rachel. "It's going to get complicated." "It's already complicated," Rachel said. "More complicated." Forsyth looked at Okwu. "You understand that when this moves forward, you'll need to be in a protective arrangement." "I've been living in a protective arrangement for 2 years," Okwu said dryly. "I've just been doing it by myself." The weeks that followed were not cinematic. They were paperwork and formal statements and the procedural machinery of multiple overlapping investigations moving at the speed that institutional processes move, which was not fast and was not satisfying on a day-to-day basis. Rachel gave 7 formal statements to 4 different agencies. She was deposed twice. She reviewed documentation, verified timelines, and answered questions from federal attorneys who were thorough in a way that was occasionally exhausting. She also ran an emergency department. The interim appointment became formal 6 weeks after the night the helicopters landed. The board voted on it in a meeting that Rachel did not attend because she was in the middle of managing a 4-car pileup that had sent 11 people through the ER doors simultaneously, and the paperwork was on her desk when she came out of it 3 hours later. Director of Emergency Trauma Operations, Riverstone Medical Center, effective immediately. She read the letter, put it in her desk drawer, went back to the floor. The changes she made were not dramatic in the way that institutional changes were sometimes made, with announcements and restructuring memos and the visual performance of a new regime establishing itself. They were specific and practical. She rewrote the triage protocol to formalize the clinical observation standards she'd been applying informally for 14 months. She established a clear escalation pathway for nursing staff to flag concerns about physician decision-making with a documented review process that had teeth. She created a monthly case review structure that included nursing and support staff alongside physicians, which was not a revolutionary idea but was one that had not existed here before. She hired 2 new nurses. One of them was a 27-year-old former Army medic who had been struggling to find placement in civilian medicine because her resume looked too military for hospitals that didn't know how to read it. Rachel read it correctly in 40 seconds and called her the same afternoon. Dr. Nair joined the monthly case reviews voluntarily after the first session and started bringing 2 other attendings with her. Patterson restructured the administrative complaint process after a direct and uncomfortable conversation with Rachel in which she laid out exactly how the previous process had been weaponized and what a functional one needed to look like. He took notes. He implemented most of it. She told him she'd be watching whether the rest followed, and she meant it. She meant most things she said. That, the staff was learning, was not a detail. Adrian Cross was convicted on 6 of 8 counts 11 weeks after his arrest. Wire fraud, obstruction, conspiracy, and 2 counts of falsification of medical records in patient deaths. The 2 people whose care had been modified and who hadn't survived. The other 2 counts, related to a broader financial scheme, were still under separate prosecution. He was sentenced in a courthouse in the Eastern District, and Rachel was not present for the sentencing because she had not been required to be and had chosen not to be. She read the outcome on her phone in the break room during a 15-minute pause between patients. 7 years, federal. Permanent revocation of medical license. Mandatory restitution to the families of the 2 patients whose deaths were tied to his falsified records. She sat with it for a minute. The 7 years, the license, the restitution, the specific reality of consequences for specific choices. It wasn't everything. It was never everything. No outcome in the human world was complete in the way that justice felt like it ought to be complete. But it was documented, public, permanent. His name was in a federal record beside those outcomes, and it would be there after she was gone and after everyone who'd worked in this building during those 14 months was gone. That mattered. She had to believe it mattered, because the alternative, that the documentation and the patience and the grinding daily work of staying in an institution that treated her as furniture, the alternative was that it hadn't been worth it, and she knew in a place below argument that it had been. She finished her tea, went back to the floor. Deb Salazar pleaded guilty to 3 counts and received a reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation with the federal investigation. 22 months, with eligibility for early release tied to continued cooperation. The plea was documented, public, specific. Rachel read about it the same way she read about Cross's conviction. On her phone, in a moment of pause, with the particular feeling of someone watching a structure she had built serve its purpose. She had not spoken to Deb since the conference room. She didn't expect to. There wasn't a conversation that made sense between them. Not forgiveness, not condemnation, just the silence of 2 people whose paths had intersected in a way that had been, on Deb's side, calculated, and on Rachel's side, a kind of long, slow discovery of what she'd been standing in. Harlan Vance entered a not guilty plea and hired 4 attorneys. His trial date was set for 8 months out. The evidence was substantial, and the prosecution was confident, which did not mean it would be simple. It would not be simple, because nothing at that level was simple, and Vance had spent 12 years understanding how to use complexity as a defense. But the documentation existed: Oku's file, Rachel's records, Salazar's testimony, the financial trails. They existed in the federal record, and they were not going away. Senator Dolan announced he would not seek re-election 6 weeks after the investigation became public. His spokesperson attributed it to family reasons. The federal inquiry into his connection to Vance's network was ongoing. Rachel noted it and moved on. She had learned a long time ago that the part of justice you could control was the part you built carefully, documented precisely, and placed in the record. What happened after that was other people's work. 5 months after the helicopters landed, Haskell came back to Riverstone. Not in uniform this time. Civilian clothes, a Tuesday morning, the parking lot wet from rain that had just stopped. He found Rachel in her office, which was a thing she had now. An office, actual walls, a window that looked out onto the ambulance bay. She was reading a staffing proposal and eating a breakfast sandwich because she'd been here since 6 a.m. and it was 9:30 and the sandwich was the first food she'd managed. He sat across from her without waiting to be invited, which was their dynamic and always had been. "Reyes is back on full duty," he said. "I heard." She'd gotten a text from Owens 2 weeks ago, Castellano too, both of them. "Thought you should know." She'd sent back a thumbs up, which was not an adequate response, but was the one she had available at 11 p.m. on a Thursday. "How's the unit?" "Better than it was. The convoy investigation closed. We got what we needed from it." He looked out the window. "The military emergency medicine program is formally approved. First cohort starts in 9 weeks. She looked up from the proposal. "Lead instructor position. Still yours if you want it." He paused. "You've had 5 months to think about it." She had. She'd thought about it in the margins of everything else. In the early mornings before the ER got busy, in the procedural pauses of the federal investigation, in the quiet of the spare room where the filing cabinet now sat empty because its contents were all in federal evidence. She'd thought about 6 facilities in 2 states and the patients in them, and the question of whether what she'd done here was a one-time thing or whether it was a skill that had a shape and could be applied repeatedly and deliberately, the way a surgical technique could be taught. She'd thought about the 27-year-old former medic she'd hired, who had walked into her first shift with the careful, calibrated posture of someone who'd been underestimated in civilian settings before and was bracing for it again. Rachel had watched her triage her first patient and had said nothing except, "Good call on the secondary assessment." The young woman had looked at her with such specific, surprised relief that it had stayed with Rachel for days. "I want both," she said. "The way we discussed. Interim mobility on the CID component based here, primary commitment to this department." "That's what the formal proposal says," Haskell said. "I sent it to your email 3 days ago." "I've been busy." "I know, I read the incident reports." He said it with something that was trying not to be pride and not quite managing. "Your triage protocol revision is being reviewed by 3 other hospital systems." "I know." She took a bite of the sandwich. "I sent it to them." He shook his head slightly. "You are genuinely. If you say unsettling again, I'm sending you back to your car." He didn't say unsettling. He looked at her instead with the expression she'd stopped needing to categorize. Not the colonel, not the operational commander, just a man who had known her for a long time and was looking at her in the way that people look at someone when they're trying to fit the person in front of them against every prior version and finding that the current version contains all of them and is larger than anyone. "You've come home," he said. She thought about that. Home was a word she'd had a complicated relationship with for most of her adult life. It was the places she'd been in, the work she'd done in them, the particular sense of rightness that came when you were applying your whole self to something that needed exactly what you had. She'd felt it in the field. She'd felt it, unexpectedly, in a hospital emergency room in a mid-sized city that mostly wasn't as progressive as it claimed to be, surrounded by people who'd spent 14 months not seeing her. She'd felt it most clearly on a Tuesday afternoon last month when the young former medic had managed a multiple vehicle trauma response without a single misstep, and Rachel had watched from 6 feet back and not had to intervene once, and had thought, this is also the work. This is what it looks like when you give someone room. "I never left," she said. "I just found another battlefield." She finished the sandwich, pulled Haskell's proposal up on her computer and started reading it properly. He sat across from her and didn't rush her, which was one of the better things about him. He understood that thoroughness was not delay. Outside the window, an ambulance pulled into the bay. She heard the doors, the voices, the particular cadence of urgency that she'd been reading correctly since before she could drive. She kept reading the proposal. The ER team would handle the initial intake. She'd read the chart in 4 minutes. She signed the proposal on page 6, initialed the scope clause she'd required, the one that made her positioning her own, and sent it back to Haskell's email while he was sitting across from her. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. "That was fast," he said. "I'd been thinking about it for 5 months," she said. "I just needed to read it." She stood, straightened her white coat, which was a thing she wore now. Director of Emergency Trauma Operations, Riverstone Medical Center, the name tag below it reading R. Morgan, RN. because the RN was the thing she'd earned and she was not going to stop claiming it, and moved toward the door. Haskell. He stood. The other facilities, she said, when the CID component activates. I need full file access before I go in. Complete picture, not operational fragments. I need to know what I'm walking into. Done. And if I determine a situation requires a longer timeline than the CID team wants, I control that call. Patience is the mechanism. If someone overrides the timeline for operational convenience, the mechanism breaks. Agreed. She looked at him. You're agreeing very easily. I learned something from watching you work for 14 months, he said. The people who were trying to manage you kept underestimating you because they thought quiet meant compliant. He paused. I already knew better. I should have operated accordingly from the start. It was the closest he'd come to a full apology. She took it for what it was. The ambulance in the bay, she said. I have to go. She went. The thing nobody tells you about the version of justice that is slow and procedural and built from documentation, the version that does not arrive on a single dramatic night, but accrues over months of formal statements and legal processes and administrative restructuring, is that it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like the continuation of work. It feels like more work, different work, work that will eventually end and leave a changed landscape, but work nonetheless. Rachel Morgan understood this better than she could explain it. She understood it the way she understood triage, not as a concept, but as a practice, as a daily physical reality, as the thing you did because the patient in front of you needed it, and you were the person present who could do it. She was not a hero in the version of the story she told herself. She was someone who had paid attention, stayed, documented, and refused to leave when leaving would have been easier. She was someone who had made mistakes. There were interactions over 14 months she'd handled imperfectly, moments where her control had been so tight that she'd missed human things, a few patients whose emotional needs she'd addressed less adequately than their clinical ones because she was running 43 parallel threads of institutional attention. She would not pretend otherwise. Imperfection was not failure. It was the texture of actual work. What she knew, standing in the ER on an ordinary Tuesday morning with a new ambulance in the bay and a department full of staff who had seen her and were still recalibrating what they'd seen, was this. The quiet person in the room is not always waiting. Sometimes they are building. Sometimes the patience you mistake for passivity is the most disciplined kind of action available, the kind that operates on a timeline longer than the one you're watching, accumulating toward an outcome that will seem sudden when it arrives. And that was, in fact, years in the making. She had spent a long time being the person nobody watched. She had used that time carefully. The patient from the ambulance was a 38-year-old man, construction accident, suspected spinal involvement. The team had him on the board correctly. She reviewed the intake, asked 3 questions, redirected the imaging sequence, and ordered a consult she knew would be needed before the imaging came back. The young former medic, her name was Torres, different Torres than the IT administrator, a coincidence Rachel had noted and filed, looked at her sequence and said, "Why the consult before imaging?" "What do the vitals tell you?" Rachel asked. Torres looked again. "Oh," she said. "Yeah, okay." "Don't just react to the information you're waiting for," Rachel said. "React to what you have. You always have something." Torres nodded, made the call. Rachel moved to the next bay. This was the work, the specific, unglamorous, endlessly renewable work of being present in a place that needed you, doing the thing you were built to do, refusing to be less than what you were because the institution around you had decided it was more comfortable if you stayed small. The refusing was the thing. The staying was the thing. The quiet, daily, documented refusal to become what they needed you to be instead of what you actually were. That was the mechanism. That was how the whole architecture eventually came down. Not with noise, with patience, with records, with the willingness to be in the room every day for as long as it took. She walked across the ER floor on a Tuesday morning, and the department moved around her. The staff who had learned her patterns, the systems she'd rebuilt, the protocols that now carried her clinical logic whether she was present or not. And she was not sentimental about it. She was accurate about it. She had changed this place. She had done it quietly and at considerable personal cost, and with the kind of persistence that didn't look heroic in motion because it looked from the outside like simply showing up. Outside the ambulance bay doors, the city went about its business. Somewhere in a federal courthouse, legal processes she had set in motion continued without her. Somewhere in 6 other facilities in 2 other states, people were doing work that hadn't been looked at clearly yet. She would get to them. She had time, and she had documentation, and she had learned, definitively, at cost, with evidence, that those 2 things, deployed with discipline and patience, and the refusal to look away, were sufficient. They were always sufficient. She had always been the strongest person in the room. She had simply stopped waiting for the room to figure that out.